Hi there. Welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. Brian and I are very excited today to welcome Paul Fenn as a special guest. Paul is co-author of Enlightenment in an Age of Destruction: Intellectuals, World Disorder, and the Politics of Empire. And reading through that, I'm struck by how rich a blend it is of philosophy, politics, economics. And I'm really excited to unpack that with you, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us. Maybe you can start us off by telling us about your trajectory and where you are in your trajectory as a thinker, and what interests you.
Well, really glad to be here. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I mean, I'm kind of a weird case, I guess. Someone who in college was looking for a hook on just what was not being really satisfied with my philosophy classes and history classes, trying to find some kind of common ground. You're reading Kant or somebody like that. It's just you read it and think, what is this guy? Like particularly when he starts talking about God, and I get confused. I grew up on welfare, and I hear the word God, and I'm just, are you crazy? So like to be able to read philosophy for me was kind of hard. I didn't understand why people were talking about this stuff, so I was looking for a hook, something that could like connect me to something I knew that I could then think about, like it would tether it. It wasn't just this transcendent, floating around kind of discourse. And so I thought of my grandfather, who was a worker and had been a farmer, came from Kansas, and he was a really fine man to me. But I learned growing up that he was a bigot. And first as a child, I adapted to it. I just laughed it off. I kind of ignored it. But as I got older, it became more and more awkward when I was around him. And he would say certain keywords that aren't really allowed anymore. And thinking like, how could you be such a nice man to your grandson, but be so belligerent toward strangers? It puzzled me. So that became my subject in college, and it led me to the subject of the crisis of the socialist political movements of the 19th century, when the working class basically became proto-fascist. That is so-called worker racism, which was a crisis in parliamentary socialism in Europe and all over the world, up to the years before the World War I. And it became very defining for me to understand like what was happening and why is it that the socialist movement that had grown so dramatically, left-wing movement, uh, just very quickly turned Nazi. And what were the intellectuals that were leading the left in Europe? What were they saying about it, and what were they doing about it, and like what was going on? So that was my undergraduate work, and led me to go to graduate school, the New School in New York, and then University of Chicago for a doctoral program. And I also studied on the side. My father's a psychologist, and so I studied the history of psychology and started looking at, and that led me into these other thinkers, or the so-called anarcho-syndicalists, who were kind of a little bit less familiar to the left, but these fascinating figures like Sorel, for example. Sorel is this very puzzling figure of anarcho-syndicalism in France. This guy that, I mean, he's a leftist, but he sure sounds like a Nazi. And, so there are these kind of non-conforming leftists, and realizing that it was a much more diverse thing that was happening in the 19th century than just Marx, and that basically the Marxists lost control of it. And watching them, studying how they lost control, but also studying this other part of the left that was looking at how do you deal with increasingly diverse society. I was studying the birth of public psychology and like madhouses, the development of madhouses after the revolution. Wrote my thesis about these madhouses and just why was this happening? The moment you have a revolution, you have madhouses appearing all over the place. So how is this relationship between madness and democracy, and like what is this? And then manipulation of the crowd, Le Bon, the crowd, Le Bon's book. But all this really writing ideology of how, which is really concerned with how do you manipulate the masses, and the politics around manipulation of the masses. And so anyway, that's kind of what framed what I did. In graduate school, then I got into ultimately everyone was studying critical theory and the French, post structuralism, but I had already done all this older, kind of earlier work and the generations of German intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, struggling with Marxism under the Nazis and writing some of the seminal works that are in some ways predate French philosophy. And those were the Frankfurt School and Walter Benjamin and these thinkers, negative dialectics. And so I read Theodore Adorno's Negative Dialectics, a very difficult book, but very interesting. And really, it was, I think, the seminal work behind resistance theory, and resistance theory being the dominant left attitude, I would say, of our time, the idea of resisting power and resisting this and that. But increasingly, I came to regard resistance as this kind of sellout, a quietism, essentially a sellout of a philosophy that could no longer really contend with what had happened, and withdrew from politics into essentially a spiritual kind of attitude of perfecting the soul and changing culture, right? So this is Herbert Marcuse and all these other thinkers. Anyway, I'm just in this milieu of thinking through like what happened to the basic ideas of the English Revolution are so simple. The French Revolution too, relatively simple. But then you get into the 19th century revolutions, and they just become wacky, from my point of view, really out of control and sort of undefined. And so, yeah, I got into this idea of positive dialectics at the University of Chicago, and I was trying to figure out what to do with it because I increasingly thought the problem is criticism itself, that criticism and writing is a problem. that we're doing all this writing, but it has no power whatsoever, and it's becoming increasingly insular and opaque and difficult to. It's being like becoming more and more self. Reflective and no longer comprehensible to anyone and bizarrely full of jargon. It's becoming this kind of priestly caste of those who know versus those who don't know, and writing cryptic books that are almost impossible to penetrate. And the less penetrable, the better. And it's almost like a kind of mysticism is setting in, a kind of I don't know, like the medieval church where people wrote bizarre books about how many angels fit in the head of a pin, and everyone's reading the books and talking about they think how many angels. It's like, what are we talking about? There's this less and less coherence to the discourse, and thinking like, well, what's the opposite? I remember I was in graduate school in 1991 thinking, what's the opposite of criticism? I want to do the opposite of criticism. I thought law is the opposite of criticism. So I want to write a law. I thought, I knew nothing about politics. I'd never even voted. I didn't care a whit about American politics and elections. I was raised on contempt toward elections, like most Americans are. And just thinking it's all lies and just forget it. But I started thinking, I'm going to write a law. And it was a matter of what kind of law. And I happened to run across a friend of mine who was in the economics school at Chicago, which is famously neoliberal economics. And he said he had this professor, Ronald Coase, and he gave me an essay by Coase. He said this guy's really important because the Chicago Board of Trade is starting to trade these emissions credits, which are traded as alternatives to pollution permits, so turning them into tradable commodities. And it's a new kind of solution to pollution, to climate change. I thought that's the most dystopian nonsense I've ever heard in my life. You'd solve, climate change by selling the rights to pollute, and turning that into a new way to make profit. And like, this is twisted. So I contacted Ronald Coase, and thinking it would be kind of like a crank call, make fun of him, he'd hang up on me or something. So I called him and said he reminded me of this Hungarian communist I've been reading, Georg Lukács, who wrote a book called History and Class Consciousness, a really wonderful book about basically it's another one of these books about the mad crowd, which is why are the workers becoming Nazis? Why aren't they revolutionary? Marx said they would become revolutionary, but they're Nazis. So like what happened? So he wrote this theory that basically said that the commodity form was taking over our minds, that everything was turning we were basically being converted to a view of all things, including our kidneys and our children and everything, as a commodity, which is the exchangeability, that everything is becoming exchangeable. That you could trade your kidney for someone else's poodle, and that there would be a basis for that exchange, and that we would accept that that is a thing that you can do, and that he was saying that commodity form is taking over our minds, and so it's basically a superseded class consciousness, the idea of revolutionary awareness of your objective condition, which is the idea of class consciousness and the precursor for revolution under the Marxist theory. So I said this to him, and he laughed, and it turns out he'd become disaffected with his own theory, and which he'd come up with years before, and he encouraged me. So he said, "Well, if you really want to get into this," because he said, "Yeah, pollution credit trading will not work. It is going to become the dominant system." He got the Nobel Prize in economics the following year for it. But he was already, an unbeliever, and he said, but this is going to all be played out in the electric industry deregulation, and which I knew nothing about electric. What a boring subject! I still hate the subject of electricity. But what I do is electricity for a living. I've done it for over 30 years now, but I've always hated the subject and don't like people that work in it generally. I mean, a few, like Mark Sardella, whom we both, by coincidence, found that we know. He's interesting, but he's a very unusual person in energy. Most people in energy are robots. And I mean, mental, intellectual robots. They just imitate what is, and they mimic it. They're all the same. But anyway, so I got into it, and I got into the Massachusetts legislature through a series of opportunities. I got a position as writing the bills for the Energy Committee in the Massachusetts Senate. He told me that electric restructuring would come first to Massachusetts and then to California, and then it would spread everywhere else. He knew this because electric industry restructuring was actually a conspiracy of the British government, Margaret Thatcher, in conjunction with Ronald Reagan, to export the British energy policy to America. Of course, I knew nothing about any of this, but the fact that this guy told me that, and I'm from California, I'm from Oakland, and my wife, still my wife today, is from Boston. I thought, well, I got to do that. That's my fate. So I spent a year temping and doing things. So I finally got a position in the state Senate after volunteering for the senator, and I had certain connections so I could find out who was who and what was what. Got this position, and that put me in charge of writing a Massachusetts electric restructuring law by the chairman of the committee responsible for that bill. So it put me in this very special position where I could do that. And so I ended up writing this bill with another fellow, Scott Ridley, which was called a municipal aggregation law. And the idea that I had at the time was to write a bill that would be an alternative to deregulation, a different model, because my idea was that I should write a law that would present not criticism of power, but an alternative to its idea. And that so it was a very simply put, that's all I was really after, was the idea that what I call the scriptural practice of theory should shift from criticism to law, and that the premise of the law should be to directly compete against power, and not simply to criticize it, but to sort of wrestle, to say, no, do this, don't do that, do this. So, I came up with this municipal aggregation idea, which was they were passing through with this it was a conspiracy because it was being pushed by Enron, if you remember Enron from the Enron crisis, and a few other big Texas companies, and in conjunction with Harvard University, Stanford University, and these are very prominent people that were involved in legitimating the idea, or legitimizing, maybe is proper English, the idea of deregulation, of saying that it would have public benefits and it would make it credible. And this is the Harvard Energy Project. Bill Hogan was a professor there, and I got to know him. And so, but my idea was, hey, why don't we, instead of just having deregulation, which is the premise of which is to remove regulation and just allow the market to decide what options exist for people, but without any protection of them by regulators, no protection of the environment, no protection of the consumer. I said, well, how about if you just let municipalities be the choosing entities, not the individual isolated person, but just let a municipality be the choosing entity. So it's a very simple thing, right? And we filed the bill 1995, and within 2 weeks I was fired. So I was out of a job, and I thought I would just move on. But I was thrilled because I got my idea on a Senate bill, a numbered bill. It was filed, and I thought I succeeded. That's just all I needed to do. I achieved this new form of literature, and I was satisfied. I thought I'd go do something else now, right? I'd publish a magazine or something. But then people that I'd kind of convinced to support the bill came up with a grant, and they offered me a small amount of stipend to promote my bill in other states. So I started doing that on the side, kind of like a part-time job for a couple of years, and became kind of an annoyance to the big money that was pushing deregulation. So they arranged for me to be defunded after 2 years. That's the Energy Foundation, all the big boys in energy policy that didn't like to have this basically one person that didn't agree with deregulation that had a grant in America, and that was me. And so they got me defunded. I was defunded. So as of 1997, I was just unemployed and nothing. But then I discovered a new thing, which was the joy of not having a boss. So I thought, well, no one's paying me, but does that mean I have to stop? So I just kept doing it without pay and pushing a bill. So I wrote a bill for California, which is, I said I'm from, and I started pushing the bill around. I was getting nowhere in Sacramento. But I did manage to get on the record when they passed deregulation in California as the person in the public saying it was a crap law and that it was going to backfire. So I got kind of quoted in the papers as some guy who didn't like the law because everyone else loved that law. I mean, really, there were almost no critics of that law. And then it got passed, and it seemed like it was a thing of the past. I went off and got some jobs here and there, and then the energy crisis hit in California in 2000. It was actually the largest financial crisis in state history. $57 billion were lost by the state in 2 months. And there were thousands of bankruptcies caused because the rates doubled. And so the markets basically totally failed. And I had predicted without really knowing that the market was going to fail. And so when it happened, I suddenly had this little bit of cachet. I went back to the legislature and found a sponsor for my bill, which is now called the Community Choice Aggregation Bill, and took 3 years to get it passed through, but got it passed through. And that started me on the thing I'm on since then, which is basically to get municipalities to use this new law, which is different from the one in Massachusetts, to localize their energy, to decarbonize their energy, to take democratic control of their energy, and it led to a big success. To my really surprise, not my success because I became very controversial and in the process, but it succeeded, and so today, almost all of California coastline is under 250 cities that have implemented the my law, and 15 million people are served by them in California. I also, along the way, wrote a revenue bond authority called the Green Bond, and this was part of the development of this new idea in California, and that got implemented. So now the CCAs in California are the largest issuers of green bonds in America. Green bonds became this really big thing, globally bigger than community choice aggregation has gotten, but also in some ways has been kind of privatized. It doesn't have any particular policy qualities. I mean, there's good green bonds, there's bad green bonds, there's all sorts of green bonds. But anyway, along the way, I've been trying to form this what I call reification to sort of mold it into a clear conceptual image of a change, of an energy transition, and so now I'm still doing this, and I'm focused on New York State. Uh, so California was called CCA 2.0 because it was different from Massachusetts, which isn't just having the municipality choose the supplier, but it's having the municipality build its own supply and sort of control the deal directly. It's more of a publicly controlled entity with much more public involvement. And then CCA 3.0 in New York came from really disillusionment with California, realizing that I had shifted the control of the model from the market, which I realized was very counterproductive because the market is corrupting, is extracting. It ruins everything. It's the obvious, the King Midas kind of thing. It turns everything to gold for itself and depletes for everyone else. But then in California, I'd kind of given the control of the government, and they formed these huge bureaucracies. And so instantly, the heads of them were making $300,000 a year, and they were indifferent and even hostile to people like me, and who are or any activists, anyone who was not a energy professional robot. And this sort of problem of bureaucracy, you have the problem of the market, you have the problem of bureaucracy. So 3.0 in New York is focused on how to restructure it so that essentially it places more control in the energy user, and specifically in their ability to share and co-invest with their neighbors. So it's a model that's focused on what are called microgrids, which are small networks of connected solar panels, electric vehicles, heating systems, etc. Nanogrids, which are smaller microgrids, and co-investment through cooperatives. So it's much more kind of hyper local, and trying to sort of shift more to prevent these large bureaucracies from forming and to have municipalities directly involved in implementation. So I'm doing that in New York now, and I got the state regulator to approve my company, Local Power, to implement that program last December, and we're working with the city and town of Ithaca, New York, to implement a pilot program right now. So sorry, long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, shall we? There's a couple things in the story there that stand out to me, and one of them is, and I think I've mentioned this before. I saw a great video where a guy was in a third world country and he was demoing out a building with a sledgehammer, and the boss came up and gave him a brand new electric chiseling device, and he was so happy. And he puts this new tool into his hands, and the guy goes over to the wall that he'd just been smashing with a sledgehammer, and he starts smashing the wall with this brand new tool. and and so, I use that as a story that sort of epitomizes to me that our technology can change, but if our way of thinking doesn't change, we end up doing the same old things with a new way to do it. And that's kind of what your story told me, and which to me indicates a nice segue into philosophy. Why do we do what we do? And I'm kind of into this idea that the Greeks had called phronesis. And phronesis is different than Sophia, which is the wisdom in philosophy. Sophia tends to be theoretical knowledge, whereas phronesis is what should we do?
Mm.
And what should we do in a particular place? And it has a lot of moral overtones, because that's the other thing that I wanted to get to about the philosophy that's living underneath your story is that we have there's an ethical conversation to have between ethics between ourselves and our fellow man, ethics between our political systems and the individuals that are comprised of it and sit under it, and ethical responsibility to the environment. And these are all fundamentally philosophical issues that sort of permeate in people that don't study philosophy. They live in this cultural narrative that is formed by that, which I think it speaks to your call to intellectuals to be able to address that, or to supplement it, to fill it in. So, as somewhat of a philosopher myself, the philosophical thread that I pulled out immediately was in the title of the book, the term enlightenment in the age of destruction. And enlightenment in common parlance or in religious terms has one meaning, and enlightenment in terms of philosophy has another meaning. And we've talked about that in the so-called the enlightenment that really changed people's way of thinking. It sort of gave birth to an approach to science. It created the world that we know and many of the horrors that you speak about in the book. And so what a lot of the things that you spoke about, you refer to the Frankfurt School, which is part of this movement. We spoke about this on the show, the idea of postmodernism. Modernism had all this great promise, and then all of a sudden we turn around and look what it does to us. And so there's a lot of responses. The Frankfurt School was definitely one kind of response, but your response is actually sort of turning the I like to say that a doctor can get the right diagnosis and still give the wrong medicine.
Uh-huh.
And I
Mhm.
feel like maybe that's what's going on here, because I don't disagree with a lot of the observations. It's just that the medicine to me often seems to kill the patient instead of making them healthy. So what do you think about that? I know you've studied a lot of the German intellectual history as a reaction to that Enlightenment idea. And then your book, I was kind of surprised in the end that it sort of fused those two ideas of enlightenment, philosophical and cultural enlightenment, with individual enlightenment, which might be where ethics lives. So what does that trigger? I mean, to sort of help the average person sit behind that conversation as, I'm going to work every day and I got to keep the lights on, and so what do you have for that?
Super fascinating. Thank you. I love what you so many things you just said. Froni, I have to look up Fronius. I didn't know about that. That's fascinating. Because I was just writing a thing about what should we do, and which occurs to me as a very democratic question. What should we do? And how strange it is to our government, which is a nation of laws, not men, and which forbids men to stand in the nave, right? Forbids human beings to hold power, which is based upon a resentment of human power, right? And a reservation of that power to representatives, to those who have been selected. And anyway, but it's a little bit out of context. But to the to the two questions of enlightenment of in philosophy, or enlightenment of science versus enlightenment of the individual, the enlightenment of of life, of how we live, um, and what we have to do to survive, what we have the adaptations that are required of so many people to survive. The classic one being of the salesman. The salesman has to live inside the product, and to think inside the product, but the same goes for a CEO. A CEO has to represent the company, and in a sense is forbidden from thinking, because thinking would be very dangerous in that role. If you were to express what is in your mind, you would be of no use to your employer. You need to have very predictable scripted remarks, and so many ways of surviving require an acceptance, a subservience, frankly, and to script, not just to persons but to laws. And so that you come in and you're informed of how it works here, and what the uh, what it is that we say about this or that we're selling, and don't leave that script. That outside the script, we're like robots. We just, please wait. We just have a blank screen that looks naively and has nothing to say, and has nothing, does not think anything, doesn't merely conceal an opinion, but does not hold an opinion. And so to have this sort of periphery to our minds, a limit, a desert on the edge of our minds, it seems to me is part of the human condition today, that we've normalized the idea of a periphery, and we have a certain amount of fear. I think fear because those who fall outside are abandoned. Those are the homeless on the sidewalk. They're abandoned not merely by the state, but abandoned by their families, abandoned by those who step over their bodies. That there is a brutality toward those who fall outside, and so that means that we have a fear of being that, not merely that we observe it or that we are brutal, but that we are afraid that we will be that person on the sidewalk. And that gets us back into psychology, and the fear of madness, which occurred to me is similar to the older fear of evil. that we feared, and our ancestors feared going to hell and feared becoming evil. But we fear madness. Uh, we fear the loss of our reason and the loss of the ability to enunciate, to have text, to have coherence. Disintegration, right? We fear disintegration, mental disintegration, and I think we fear it because of that periphery that we have consented to the loss of authority over our ideas or our thoughts. That and then in the act of consenting, that it means that in a sense that we are mad, that there's a profound instability to our thoughts and our opinions that makes us very vulnerable to authority. So I'm not sure if I'm just going in circles here and trying to answer your question, but I do think it's super important, the idea of a philosophy based on Fronius. You said
Phronesis.
Phronesis. I'm going to look that up.
Yeah, yeah.
Sophia, which I did know, wisdom, the abstract idea of wisdom versus the practical, I guess you could say.
I think it's one of Aristotle's 3 types of wisdom,
Okay, okay, yeah, I never really studied Aristotle.
along with episteme.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I think it's super important. But as far as energy and what makes energy germane to that subject, I do think, and what really got me into increasingly about energy, even though I don't like the subject, is just that it's so much of what we think of as ourselves. That energy is this kind of replacement for of the self, in the sense that our lives, not just Americans, but increasingly the world, is so full of energy, and so much of what we say we do is really energy doing it. The right now we're on a screen looking at electronic screens, we images of each other, but it feels like we're looking at each other, but we aren't. And I drove my son to the university, but actually I didn't. The car drove him there. I was just operating the car, and I was sitting the whole time. I didn't do anything. And cleaning my house, there's this machine that does it. I follow it around. It's a vacuum cleaner. And the same with the mower. Communication, thought. Now, we have Google to look things up. We've lost the ability to go to the library and look in the catalogs and find things. We just ask the computer and it tells us. Please.
I just want to ask then. I mean, the psychological insight you shared about we're terrified of becoming mad, of losing coherence, because we've already abdicated ownership of society. If I understood correctly, it's just a profound insight. And it struck me that you were using we, and I wonder, since you walk around with that insight and this insight of we don't actually do anything, how do you live? What's important to you in how you construct your own life and the choices that you make as you're in dialogue with that awareness?
That's a really tough one to answer. Well, I over the years, I've always lived on the edge, financially. So I never had to choose how to live, because how I lived kind of chose for me. And I was doing these projects, so I very rarely got paid. So I was always out of money and constantly being evicted, and and then I eventually just ran out to the end, and we moved out to the East Coast, partly just 'cause I couldn't go on anymore. We were living in a off the grid sort of shack in the redwoods in Mendocino for a few years, and so I moved to back here to Massachusetts, and my father-in-law died, and so we got a little money and bought a little farm. And I always thought if I ever got some money, I'd buy a farm, because that way, particularly if you get a farm that isn't worth very much, then your taxes aren't very high, and you have land, so you can farm it and live at a low cost. So it was always avoided cost, approach to life, how to avoid costs. And increasingly, I've come to think of that as being the true meaning of wealth, right? Is that you don't need money. having lots of money is not wealth. Not needing money is wealth. And so, if you have a solar system, I know, Brian, you're talking about yours, right? Then you had to come up with some cash for the panels and the equipment and all that. But once you got it in, then it's free, right? Yeah, it's free. And everything changes when it's free, because no longer do you really need to save energy, right? Because it just is. The sun's out, the panels are going. So what do you want to do? You want to need some energy? Or if you don't, then it's just going to go to waste. Or use it if you want. It's sort of like living next to a waterfall. You save, you just save, put the water into a tank next to the waterfall. But we're putting solar, slowly getting the stuff together to get that up and try to just get as many costs away as possible. And that's always been for me how to do it. Um, it's just there's how do you chase money? If you don't chase money, then avoid cost. And it kind of guides me, so I don't have to make all the decisions because if I had money, I'd probably be in trouble, really, because it's hard to navigate these things. And whenever I have had money, I found I tended to waste it. But the main thing, I guess, for my sanity is to just to continue to follow ideas and have my labor, my work, not be determined by money, which meant that I often had to work without pay. I mean, I'm working right now without pay. I do have these. I mentioned, the contracts in New York, and so occasionally I'll get work where I get paid, and then I'll just live off of that for a while, as long as it lasts. Uh, so I've worked, and my company does get paid for the work that we do for cities, and San Francisco and Marin and Sonoma, different research and development contracts. We've actually had pretty good paying work on and off. But I just I keep working on it whether or not I'm getting paid, and then if I could develop something far enough, then money will kind of come to it once it's mature, and then I'll get these sort of infusions of money from people that want to do what I'm doing, and then often it'll just dry up, and then I'm out again. So it's just a different kind of pattern, really. I guess would be the answer to that. It's just when you're
That's the artist's pattern.
yeah, it is. It's just like an artist. I tell people I live just like an artist, pretty much. It's
Yeah,
similar kind of work.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You get a commission, and then it's you're living in it, and then the next thing you go, it's like, what? Does this even work? Does this whole idea even work? Yeah,
So true.
yeah.
Yeah, you become aware of kind of like dying. I always think of it as like I got old 10 times because when you die, everyone forgets you, you know. And uh and so I have this experience of being forgotten over and over again. What I mean? Like Tom Sawyer going to his own funeral.
Right.
Art's like that because you do the art and when you're doing it, it's such a. I've done some painting and music and things over the years, and it's so divine. Like when you're really into a making something and you're like halfway through it, you're not done yet, but you're also not starting it. It's just this amazing thing, and then you
Mhm,
finish it. It's just this object, and it slowly fades. It becomes kind of nothing. And
uh-huh.
then someone else comes along and says, "Wow, this is so great." And they give you a
Right.
ton of money and then they leave. And then you
Yeah,
give the money, it's just so incoherent. The
yeah,
relationship ultimately we have to other people economically is incoherent. But that's as coherent as it gets because you actually made something that you made and they
mhm,
bought it. And most work doesn't even it's right is alienated. It doesn't have those components. It's just you're told what to do and you do it. You jog in place and you receive a check and you have no idea what happened after. I don't know how people live that way. Frankly,
right.
I find that
I myself couldn't, I got into making artifacts that had a certain value within a marketplace, and then how I made them, when I made them, how long my hair was, whether the music was too loud, all those details. They didn't care. They wanted it in the piece of jewelry that I made. I started out as a jeweler and a sculptor. So I've always looked at just creating value. But because what you're saying is I always felt vulnerable financially. So that's what put me out into the desert. It's like, well, I was abused by a landlord. And I said, never again, never again. If I have to live under a tree. So I went and got some cheap land that had a bunch of trees, and And it was the ticket to my liberation. It really was.
Land is it's so true. You think about how
Yep.
much money people spend on houses, you know? It's just a box. It might be a
Right.
beautiful box, but that's all it is,
Right.
it's a box,
Right.
you know? Uh,
Well, Thoreau talks about that a lot,
oh,
and about how in his time, not 2 in 5 farmers owned their own land, but every Indian has his own wigwam, he said. It's like, of course, like how natural and obvious is that, you know? But what you were saying makes me think, because there's been a theme that I've seen running through history. And, I've mentioned before on the podcast, through the Reformation, through the American Revolution, and that's kind of been the empowerment of the individual. And just this whole idea of democracy, or the Reformation, where all of a sudden it's not the priests, it's you. In democracy, now it's not the kings, the princes, the ones appointed by them, it's you. And I'm kind of wondering, have we really grown into that, do you think? Because it seems to me like a lot of your observations are, the Lao Tzu talks about people, the mediocre type of person. He says they seem aware and yet unaware. And some of your observations about democracy and where it is right now, I mean, I think you started out, you said circus like quality, which I think, we'd have a hard time arguing with that. However conservative minded we might want to be. Are we looking at, because I look at what you're doing in the hyper localization of things, which to me just vibes in as exactly correct, exactly the correct direction to go. But we've seen this modern tendency of morality to get concentrated up into the upper executive classes, and no morality judgments are allowed for anybody below that. But it seems to me that all these forces are driving that responsibility down to the individual more and more and more. I mean, that's why I don't ever talk to anybody about their carbon footprint, but I try to have as small a carbon footprint as I can have, right? So my thought is, you see something there in people responding to the new laws, and the idea of community choice. I mean, it does drive it down to the user. But it almost has to does it presuppose them waking up on some proto-democratic level, do you think?
yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I always think of Walter Benjamin's statement that the greatest error or mistake of left wing socialism was the idea that history is on our side. You know, that like we're headed towards some great thing. We just have to ride it out, as opposed to the idea that no, we're probably pretty much screwed. You know, but maybe we should do something. You know, to go back to the question, what should we do? And so I do think there's a dialectic in there, though, which I could describe what you just described, that this force as a dialectical force that could be for better or worse, that it can push, it does push the sort of envelope of subjectivity back toward the individual, because the of the epiphany of a failing state, right? That the state fails, that regulation fails, right? We see this with with environmental regulation, with toxics regulation, energy regulation, just a farce. I mean, utter farce. Uh, and so we're watching the state fail. We're watching this circus of the state, and it makes us aware that it's not better than me. Like, you know, what I mean, each of us looks and thinks, I could do that. Like, what's the matter with these people? You know, so the whole kind of exterior aura of the aristocrat, we want to call it the superior leader, it's just gone. There's no one. It's not Joe Biden. It's not Donald Trump. It's not anyone in that building is worth a damn compared to the average person you ever met in your life. And that is an epiphany which makes you feel like I don't need this. You know what I mean? I don't need this. At the same time that it's also this kind of, it seems to me it's also a kind of, going back to the subject of madness, it introduces a risk of madness, because it's a crisis of representation. That our ideas, so many of our political ideas, come from religion, and representation. This my new book is about representation. I think is a core kind of recycled Christian idea of that you find in the water into wine and the bread the body and the bread of Christ, the transubstantiation, and the idea of the Pope as the vicar, and the idea of that someone represents you. I really do think is a recycled concept, an abstraction that I myself have struggled to let go of, because it holds everything together. That without representation, the idea that America, for example, is somehow more of a democracy than Russia is not very defensible. Without representation, without the idea that representative government is somehow democratic. And I would say that it is not. That arguably a monarchy is more democratic than representative government, because it's an actual person who holds that power, a person. And a system of representation, it's really hard to say who's in charge.
Plato made a similar observation.
I think I may have come across, I might be stealing from Plato. Well, it's not so bad. He's
Yeah.
old.
That a really good king, if he's really a good king, he's the best
He's the
solution
best
because
there is.
he can make everything turn on a dime. But if he's a tyrant, then he's the worst of all possible worlds. So I said democracy never gets real good, but at the cost, it's supposed to never get real bad at the cost of never getting real good.
All right.
For what that's worth.
Yeah.
Aristotle, I think, laid out 6 different forms of government. And so there's some distinctions there. Polity being, I think, his highest, which is the direction that you're suggesting that things move. Really, is in the direction of polity.
Yeah, I guess that's maybe where the individual meets the government, right? That the polity, the city hall, is a place you can go, and that anyone can go. It struck me a while back that in that sense, that localism is in a way the only universalizable political concept.
Mhm.
That every person in the world really ought to support the principle of local power, because everyone lives in a place and wishes that place to have power, because it is accessible.
Right, right,
And
right,
yeah, and so there is this sort of, place where you can be an individual, be particular, to use the word you used, Brian, and at the same time to be public, to be not isolated, to have power, but for that power to be
right,
palpable, and so but it's on the other hand, the crisis of representation really puts our democratic ideals to the test. And I think in some ways, as Americans, as Europeans, we're really these sort of Germanic barbarians who have appropriated all these ancient philosophies without really ever having believed any of them on a certain level. That our Christianity was full of hypocrisy pretty much from day one, and our democratic idealism has a similar hypocrisy to it. That we seem to we like holding the cross, we like the symbols, we like the rituals, but in a very pagan way, a very promiscuous
right,
way. And how serious are we really about democracy? It seems is a question.
right, right,
That's where I've sort of tried to focus on not just the localization of political power, which I think is sort of part of a concept, but it's an incomplete part. Because
uh-huh,
I work in municipal government, and largely speaking, municipal governments imitate central governments. It's more of like your thing of
sure,
the tool. They don't use the local. They act like they're little presidents. The mayor's a little governor, and the governor's a little president, and the city council is a little legislature, and they police and they tax and all these very medieval oppressive instruments that they use. They'd never do anything for anyone. And so I'm dealing with. I say these are my clients. I'm trying to. They won't watch your show, but some of them do. But it's a thing. They're not used to it. They're used to giving people parking tickets and speeding tickets and taxing them and punishing them, and then they get all this money and they burn it in the name of abstract goods, of
Right.
spend the money.
Well, and it almost seems like philosophy lives in two places here.
Hmm.
In one place, it feeds the raw materials for the rhetoric, the sound bites that we get fed. But on a deeper level, there is the philosophy that each person lives out of. For example, there's what I say, but do I believe that there's a creator that's going to make me burn in hell for eternity if I do something against this code? If I live out of that, I might behave in a certain way.
Mhm.
If I live out of a hyper mechanistic, the Humean world that says there's no way to get aught out of is, there's just stuff. It's only materialist, reductionist, clever ping pong balls bouncing into each other. So where is any morality? And does that just dump us into a world of strict realpolitik where we say whatever we need to say to do what we're going to do, which is based on pure and unadulterated self-interest? Aristotle, looks at two questions in the forms of government. One is, where does the power lie? With an individual, with an elite group, or with the people? But the other side of the question is, in whose interests is that power exercised? In the for a single individual, for an elite group, or for the masses? And so you get all the variations based on those answers to those two questions. So, I mean, I guess I'm still coming back to morality and virtue,
Uh-huh.
and ethics, the ethics we live out of, not the ones we speak.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, I like it.
And and that democracy has to come out of that place?
I think that I think I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's
Mhm.
the way I've come to think of it, I guess, is that we have asceticism is a core along with representation is an ascetic idea of politics, which I think is also very Christian. The idea that we should be selfless, that public participation in government should be a selfless process.
Love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yeah, and that if you're seeking gain from politics, that you are corrupt, another Christian word. It strikes me as being a sterilizing power. That part of the reason why no one participates in politics, particularly local politics. And I say participate because I don't consider voting for president to be participation. But to actually go to a meeting, to actually watch what's going on, to say something, to be a factor in what's happening, that's
To
almost
watch the sausage get made.
yeah. But I'd also like to be there and grab the handle and
Mhm.
yell at people and get in on it. That doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen except for just certain weirdos that do that. And it's like 1 in 10,000 people, right? So it's a tiny margin of people that actually participate in politics in America. And I think part of the reason is that it's so boring. It's boring. Oh my God. I go to meetings, okay, and I want to kill myself. It's just like going to church and a Church of England, Episcopal. I mean, you couldn't be more bored. You're just dying.
Except you gotta do homework, right? To really know what opinion to have.
Yeah, but it's also the selflessness of it. It's that you're supposed to be there for the greater good and all this, and you're supposed to give your time and give, give, give. It's very churchy. It's very boring. And I come to think that really that part of the really important part of with energy, what I'm trying to do now is I want people to have a reason to go to meetings. And that means a selfish reason. And that's what I'm trying to do with this CCA 3.0 is I want activists to not just be going to meetings and begging and pleading with public officials to do climate action, right, or to do these things. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I've watched people die doing this. Okay, that I friends of mine that work with allies die going to meetings every week after week, month after month, year after year, begging, pleading, dying because the governments are so brain dead. And the elections are such frauds. I mean, representation is a scandalously stupid thing. And so the representatives that we have, I would say almost universally, there are exceptions, but they are exceptions. It's terrible. And so we have to admit this. We have to admit that that it's very upsetting to go to the meeting. It's very upsetting to see who's in charge, that the selective criteria clearly are not working, and that just we should question this process, that we need to question it. And we need to question that certain officials have more validity in their speech
Mhm.
than anyone, number one. And number two, and that we should be selfless. And instead, that's where the 3.0 is really focused on letting activists participate in order to go to the city or go to the town instead of saying, please do something for the environment. Instead, come in and say, we want to build a microgrid on our house with our neighbors, and you're going to help us. And we're doing it. We're not asking you to do it. We're doing it. You're going to help us. This has a more moral force. It has a motive. It has Germanic energy,
Mhm.
selfish Germanic energy, not, oh, we're all good church mice and we all want to help the world and sacrifice for the greater good. All these repulsive politics, which for me are just utterly disgusting, and I just can't stand it anymore. The selfless ascetic quality of politics in a system which is so avaricious and destructive that we would pretend to be, selfless inside of a government which is so utterly consumed by selfishness, right? Anyway, so for me, that's there's to get in there and to localization, but also to flip the idea of what is the purpose of the government? That shouldn't the purpose of the government be to enrich us, to enrich me, me, that I
Yeah.
am the we, that the we is not the elected official who calls himself the mayor. The we is not the abstract masses of whoever is sitting in their lazy boys somewhere. No, the we is me because I'm showing up this stupid meeting and I'm getting some. And from my point of view, that's a formula for success. Like that's like, okay,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
can get some real people now to show up at some meetings. They don't have to be church mice, and
Right.
that's like got some visceral energy, which I like, and I think it's part of the change is that we need to think of democracy in less abstract terms of representation and asceticism, and more in participatory terms, like Benjamin Barber used to write about. And he imagined it and he proposed. I've ever read his book Deep Democracy, and he wrote a bunch of books about trying to like, how do we do this? I really think to do it, you have to change the idea of it. You can't just tell people go participate. What is that? That's like go to church, come to church. It's totally ineffectual. It's no, we need to reconceive of the town, the city, to think of how to change it so that it can be fund itself differently. Like the aggregations, the community choice programs, they control more revenue than the cities do, right? So when Oakland took over the CCA, they control more revenue in that program than their discretionary budget of the city, because it's controlling the whole paycheck of the whole community, right? So it's a huge amount of money. These CCAs control billions of dollars a year in revenue. The cities are only controlling 5% of their budgets. Everything else is mandated, right? So you'll have like maybe $50 million of discretionary funding in the city of Oakland that they can actually decide what to do with out of hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. But the CCA is billions. So, like, if city governments can be change their mission from we're going to tax you, we're going to regulate you, we're going to all this kind of stuff, police traps. I mean, they're predatory. And say, all right, listen, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to fund the police department on parking tickets, on drug bus. It's predatory. It's medieval predatory behavior, and it's considered to be acceptable. And we're supposed to go in there and honor that. I mean, that's what I think about. It's like, I'm gonna honor that? I have to go in,
Now
you know?
now that seems to me like almost more of a cultural critique than a political critique.
I think it has to be seated in culture for us to participate. Otherwise, we just watch, you know? which is what we do. We watch with fascination, but also disgust, and we just watch our whole lives. I do it. Everybody does it. We watch, we talk, we watch, talk, and then we scream at each other, but we don't never do anything. And it's the doing side. I really think, like, when your question, go back, what should we do? It actually means we. It doesn't mean what should the government do. It means what should I do with you? What should we do? And if we could return to that, it becomes a democratic question and not a representative question. And so I really think there's a lot of energy there, and it can, I think it could be very creative, but it does involve not just this sort of populistic idea of the people united will never be defeated. That's bullshit, and I hate that kind of rhetoric. We have to acknowledge how dysfunctional our civil society is and not pretend that we're united. We completely lack solidarity. We are not united. We are hostile and paranoid apes. And we need a good reason to cooperate, or we're not going to do it. And so to get off our high horse and admit to the problem, which isn't just about like carbon footprint or environmental consequences, it's that we're really messed up. And the civil society is, the children are basically crazy, and the civil society is just disintegrating before our eyes. And the poly crisis, so called, includes people, and it's the most disturbing part of it because, like I said, I mean, it's like we're going mad, and it feels really quite uncontrollable, like we're actually going to go mad. I mean, we're gonna just start wandering around in the streets and like being insane. I mean, it appears to be approaching in some ways. And like, unless we can break through what I think is this envelope of representation, where we've forgotten that the bread is not the body, the wine is not the blood, it is wine. And, you know, and return to, I would say, not that I celebrate paganism, but a simpler, obvious reason.
First person.
Yeah, stop the symbolism. Like, we don't need symbols. We're drowning in symbols, and just it's saturation with symbols, and everything becomes symbolic, which is the nature of paranoia. When I think when symbols become like too powerful, you become schizophrenic. It's a state of schizophrenia that has there's too much power in the objects, and they shouldn't be given that power. And so it's like we need to disengage from symbolism, and we need to sort of find our feet and accept our materiality, our material existence, and the need to serve it, like you were saying, like we actually survive. I need to eat, I need shelter, uh, you know, and so it is a problem that my property tax bill requires I come up with 500, 1,000, 2,000 bucks per month, depending on where you live. That's a problem. And to say, oh no, it's for the greater good, pay your share. No, I don't want to pay my share. I want to stop fixing the roads. That's what I want to do. And because I don't want to pay for it anymore. And it's like, okay, well, what about the common? So the road is the commons now. Okay. Uh, really, we need to like question these things, because if all we're doing is fixing the road over and over again, uh, you know, and I would apply the same thing to schooling. Frankly, I think the schools are madhouses, and so the idea that we towns sacrifice themselves to their schools is like, what are we doing? What is this? Well, public education. What does that mean? No one's educated. And this has been going on for over half a century. This doesn't work at all. But I mean, what's going on? This is just autopilot. And so if we aren't willing to change what local government does, localization won't help us.
So my question then is, is this a cyclic? We've talked about this before on the podcast, and there are theoreticians, historians who talk about various chapters and cycles. And, I know a few of them have been popular recently. I think, what was it? The Fourth Turning, I think, was one of the books. But of course, it's not new. John Battista Vico, James Joyce wrote about him, and so there. Do you think we're caught in a cycle? Like, that was my question in the election. Does it matter who we vote for? Because if I'm in a car that doesn't have brakes, it really doesn't matter who's driving, because the problem is more fundamental than that. I mean, do you think this is cyclic? Can we fix it? Do we just live through it? What do you think?
That's a very good question. It's terrifying. I mean, this is we're entering this terror zone because the nation state has nuclear weapons, and so when the nation state fails, which it has done, it has. I would say it's conclusively failed, and not just because of the election of Donald Trump, although it that he makes it obvious because of his clown mask and all that, and draconian behavior. But it's the Democrats were toying with World War there as last time I checked for no reason apparently, and so the degree of disintegration of the state, but the state retains these weapons, and it creates a terror scenario where if the state fails, then what happens to the weapons, and then you have all these other sort of security risks that the state itself present to the population, to other populations, to our populations. The use of warfare obviously being the obvious one, as an instrument of domestic policy, to solve your domestic problems by starting wars, and so there's a certain kind of cage surrounding our discourse. Speaking of peripheries, where there's a limit, the territorial imperative, to the capacity to discuss national politics. But it returns me to one of the great lessons for me of doing CCA, because one of the great lessons for me came from winning, because I never thought I would win. It never even occurred to me that I would win. Really, I thought of it as an act of literature. Just I want to get an idea, a theory, onto a bill, and like print it on the state ledger. But when it passed, I was very surprised, and then I got to the next phase, which was seeing it be implemented and being incredibly disappointed and disillusioned. But then having to go back to the drawing board, do 2.0 in California, have no one care about it, and realize no one cared about it at all. It just didn't matter to anyone. And I went all over and trying to get legislative support, and just got just nothing. It was just like, go away, nothing. But then I finally occurred to me, well, I would just ask for a. I'm just going to ask the city of Oakland. I'm from Oakland, for a non-binding resolution. I said, I went to the president of the city council, Ignacio de la Fuente, his staffer, this Mexican guy, and said, all right, you don't agree with it. You don't want to do aggregation. You don't care about it. It's a stupid thing. But don't you think you should be allowed to do it? He was like, yeah, I mean, what? Sure, whatever. Yeah. So we'll just have a resolution that says you should be allowed to do it, just in case someday you decide maybe you want to, And it was like, sure, pass right through. Just boom, I drafted up a resolution. Pew, and a resolution. Then I went around to San Francisco, Marin, uh, Fairfax, and then Berkeley, and a bunch of LA cities. So I ended up with 15 or 20 resolutions. And that was partly how I pushed the bill through, was I had the resolution. Now, I knew that no one cared. No one that passed the resolution gave a damn about it. But having the resolution helped me get a sponsor, a bill sponsor, because I could go after the assembly member that was uh, I go after the assembly members who represented the towns that had resolutions, and they would feel a certain pressure. And I became aware it's like they feel pressure that their colleagues locally adopted the resolution, and just because they did, you're picking a fight if you don't support the resolution of the town. It's like, what, you're not going to do? We said do it, and you're not doing it. So now you're going to
Right.
get an opponent in the next election. I thought, there's some economics here. This is sort of like the idea of a selfish reason to go to a meeting. There's some economics here, which is that, yes, the legislator doesn't care about any ideas, and this is I would say, a categorically true statement. Simply as an occupational hazard, has no regard for any idea ever. But they do care about having unnecessarily incurring the risk of an opponent in an election. So I started realizing there's a magnetism inside of local democracy, which is that if a city adopts something, it exerts this upward pressure, upward into the legislature, to specific people, not the general legislature, but just the delegation from that town feels a certain pressure to do it. And so then I got a sponsor, Carol Migden from San Francisco, sponsored the bill. And immediately I had no influence with her, and she was this power broker Democrat who just, She was ruthless. And so she immediately started doing deals with Pacific Gas and Electric, the big utility out there. And I heard about it. I got a whiff. They're selling out the bill, you know. So I said, screw it. I put out a press release to all the towns that had adopted a resolution saying she's selling out the bill. My sponsor, I exposed her to the wrath of her delegations. She was so pissed. I mean, she hated me ever since then. But this is just my epiphany, which was that these people who didn't care at all about the idea, I mean, not at all, like bored, can we end this meeting now, bored? All of a sudden they were interested. She did what? PG&E did what? They don't want us to do what? And they were like, awake. Now I want to do it. And I realized that was like this first phase where it just bumped up into the consciousness of these people who do not think. They go entirely by smell, right? The elected official goes by smell. If you're on my side, I'm with you. If you're on the other side, I'm against you. I form my position because you're a Republican, you like this, so I don't like this. Because it's territory. I will go and get money from the opponent of the person you're getting money from. So there's this natural Rubik's Cube kind of structure to this insect brain of the elected official, which can be manipulated through organic democracy. That you first get the local, simple expression of preference, no commitment, and it starts this kind of tarantella where they can't stop dancing because they said this and then you said that and then they said dialectic, they said this and you said that. Next thing you know, they're like doing this little dance and they can't control their bodies, you know, and it forms into a conflict. And so I could then play on the conflict by interpreting the conflict. So I would basically write, do, you know, unsolicited, free anarchist journalism, interpreting what was going on and just putting it out as press releases, you know, declaring that San Francisco was about to implement this huge program to do, you know, the whole citywide. And I started getting them published in journals and things, like predicting what was going to happen. And then I went to the regulator and started warning. I went in for 2 years and testified and cross-examined witnesses and said, I started confronting them, the utilities in front of the regulators, saying you're in a conflict of interest and you're going to try to block aggregation because it threatens you, because these cities are going to do all this localization and they're going to destroy your business. And the utilities panicked and they fielded a constitutional amendment and put it up for a public vote in 2010 called Proposition 16. PG&E spent $57 million on this proposition. I started the No campaign. We raised $100,000, but we beat them. And the reason we beat them was that all the cities by now, this is 2010, right? I had done this stuff 10 years before. So I've been doing all this for 10 years by now. And when PG fielded that thing, we just went to the same cities and said, look, they're trying to block you again. And we went to the press and said they're trying to block the cities that are doing climate action. The utilities trying to block the cities doing climate action. And of course, their consultants were trying to sell it as a tax initiative. They called it Taxpayers' Right to Vote Act. We're going to protect taxpayers. So we just laughed and howled at them, saying, "Isn't that funny? They're trying to protect the taxpayer. Isn't that hysterical?" And it kind of seduced everybody into this food fight where all the newspapers in the state were against PG&E, and they were plastering, like every television, everywhere you went, every restaurant, every bus, every train had a Prop 16, stop aggregation. It's a government takeover of your energy. And all of a sudden, everyone in the entire state of California knew what CCA was. They lost narrowly. The CEO was fired. And within a few years, it was a statewide thing. It was like the Dialectic just went totally out of control for them. And it was really this sort of finessing from zero, you know, like getting a little bounce to happen. I was like getting a little ball to bounce and just kind of keep kicking it and spinning it. It's boing, 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 boing. And, you know, it just built up into a tsunami. And it's resulted in, like I said, it's 15 million people. It's half the population served by CCAs.
That's amazing.
And it really kind of blew my mind, you know, just how that local government can exert power. that just blows the crap out of the whole system, because it is the only organic foundation of any of it that's real. The rest of it is completely fake, really.
I think we might come back to that, but I wonder if this is also a place, some of our listeners are are folks I've known for a while, and I have 25 years in renewable energy. I'm now branching out from renewables and doing some other stuff, but in your book, and you've hinted at in this conversation also, you have a strong critique of how the renewable energy industry works, and how not just the local versus writ large approach to energy, but also kind of how energy companies work and how renewable energy companies work. And I imagine you have some thoughts about how systems are financed, and how incentives align maybe more around large scale, as opposed to distributed generation. And I think it would be useful for our listeners to hear kind of your view on the energy industry, and then and that might also shed light on why CCAs were important to you from that standpoint.
Okay. Well, big subject. Yeah, the energy industry is such a bizarre thing, you know. I mean, well, one who was it? S. David Freeman. You know, he was a big Tennessee Valley Authority head under Carter, and I got to know him for a while. He was at Sacramento, and he was this old timer. I think he's dead now, but he used to say the utilities are basically run like the CIA. You know, they are surveillance organizations that are primarily concerned with the protection of their revenue streams. So they keep a closer eye on government than any other entity. They have the most surveillance in place just on the ground. Every town hall. No one else covers every town hall and knows what's going on a 24/7 basis. No one. So it's like, in a way, they should be the newspapers. You know what I mean? Like the energy industry ought to just switch and become the new newspapers, because they know what's going on. No one else does. Um, because they're protecting their interests, though. Obviously, that would make a farce of it. But you know that they're this core of the system, and part of the post-war order, which was, corporatist, an alliance between government and the largest corporations. They are the largest corporations. They're the center of the economy, largest concentration of capital in the economy. And after the war, obviously, the Cold War was in effect, and control of energy resources was the strategic concern of the Cold War. So energy corporations have this very intimate relationship with the military, with the security, national security state. They're in on it. You know, the leaks from Barrett Brown a while back. So among the big leaks was the leak that the NSA was being given lists of activists by PG&E and big utilities. Literally, NSA is asking PG&E, who are the people that you think are threats to your business, because we think they might be what they called, when it was leaked out. NSA said yes, they were considered to be potential future terrorists. Their explanation being that, well, because the government's not doing anything about climate change, they're likely to become more radical and therefore resort to acts of terrorists. We have to keep an eye on them. But just this kind of intimacy that they would ask PG&E to tell really upset me, because obviously I would probably be on that list, and I probably did more damage to PG&E than anybody. So I was like, God, they're asking PG&E who the bad guys are. That's pretty bad. This shows an umbilical cord between the government and the energy industry, and particularly the terrestrial energy, the domestic power industry, which is disturbing. And my experience in politics with them is, yeah, that they are like battleships. They have this profound, long-standing, overarching hegemonic power within public policy circles, which goes in cycles. It goes up and down, but I've been watching them for 30 years, and they always come back on top. I mean, PG is the best example. They're back on top again in California. Their rates have doubled in the last year. They've had like 6 or 7 rate increases back to back, approved by the state. It's like, what is going on? They're not even pretending to regulate this company. And this is a company that's been bankrupt several times, caught, convicted of felonies by stuff they did against us. The CEO fired. I mean, they should have been gone years ago, but they're on top 100%. They've profited from the forest fires, right? They didn't get hurt by them. They profited by them. So their hegemonic power is overwhelming. And it creates, I think, an intimidation factor in the rest of the energy industry and a dependency by those industries, including solar, including everyone, energy efficiency companies, solar companies, all depending ultimately on payment streams, transactions, administration of transactions, tariffs, regulation, policy support, facilitation of those utilities. So, to a certain extent, everyone in the industry is depending upon them. And it creates, I think it poisons the policy discussion where it's impossible to have a collaborative, but this pretense of regulation in America, which is that we can work with the utilities to, on a solution to this. This is a farce. Okay. This is like working with a rapist. Okay. It's like, take the handcuffs off, please, would be the thing to say to this rapist, not, hey, can we just get along? Will you stop hitting me so hard? I mean, it's abuse. And so I do think there's this kind of culture of abuse in energy, which is pervasive and in many ways undermining that everyone's sort of in on it, without meaning to be really, that everyone's kind of depending on that system. Everyone's part of the problem. It's like, if you're not, maybe not, you're in the mafia, but you still have to pay the protection money. And once you're paying that protection money, you really can't talk about it. And so the way and a lot of that was focused on anti-communism, right? The alliance and the purpose of the utility, the regulatory system set up by the Congress after the crash of 1929, when the Congress was prepared to nationalize the power industry, because the power industry was blamed for the collapse of 1929. The power industry manipulation of stock in the power industry triggered the collapse in 1929. So that's why people went to prison who were responsible, because they were hunted down. And Samuel Insull being the most famous, Consolidate Edison, Chicago, who was hunted down in Paris and dragged back to America because they caused such massive damage. And the Congress was ready to take it all over. And FDR did the deal, as he was wont to do, cutting the baby in half and creating the regulatory system we have, which is a compromise deal to avoid socialist ownership of utilities. And so we have essentially a hybrid system, which is fake. So in my whole career, and I've dealt with not all commissions, but I've dealt with quite a few state regulatory commissions, and some, California, New York, Massachusetts, a few others. They're all uniformly just atrocious. I mean, and I'm not trying to overstate this, okay? Regulation is like representation. They rhyme for a reason. They both mean basically just nothing. And so the regulators do not regulate. They're protection rackets. They always have been. There occasionally are regulators who rise up and try to be the hero and do the real thing. They get torched and they're gone and it resumes. And that's just the system we have. It's fake. And so all the systems we have are fake. And particularly the renewable energy certificate system is the core of the renewable energy industry in America. That system goes back to Ronald Coase, the professor that I started me off, right? He created the model for that. And so I did CCA 30 years ago, and immediately the CCA started buying credits, certificates, renewable energy. It was just torture for me. It was like, oh God, I come up with an alternative to certificates, and they're buying certificates. Like you said, they take the new tool and start smashing the wall with it, Brian. It was just so disgusting and depressing. And it's been ever since then. I have this agonistic struggle with the cities to persuade them to stop doing this. You know, and they just won't stop. They will not stop. They imitate the master. They think, oh, we're getting into energy business. Well, how's it done? We'll learn from the utility. They do it. We'll do it like them, but just a little bit better. Not realizing, no, if you do it, you're not doing better. There is no better version of this. Fraud is fraud. There's no good fraud. There's just fraud. And so they're doing the certificates, and almost like here in Massachusetts, the aggregations. There are over half the state is in aggregations here.
What do you mean, Paul, when you say renewable energy certificates are fraud? Did I understand that connection?
Yeah, I did, and the certificates are are fraud because they are based upon statutory language which says the holder of this certificate, which represents 1 megawatt hour of energy, does not consist of the energy, but only the attributes of the energy, may legally characterize his energy product as renewable, even though it is not renewable. So, in the simplest English sense, it means you can lie. That you're selling non renewable energy and you're saying that it's renewable because you hold a piece of paper. So, I claim that this goes back to the issue of madness, which is that, public policy would say, well, there's good reason for this lie. It's a white lie or a green lie, if you want to call it a green lie, but that there's good reason, that it's here as an instrument, as an incentive. It creates an incentive in the marketplace, a needed incentive. What I would say is that's codependence. That the only it's like saying, how do we make daddy drink less? Be nice to daddy, play games with daddy. Daddy's a drunk. Don't say he's a drunk. Don't pull the bottle. Don't call the officials. Just be nice to daddy. Maybe he'll drink less. Uh, we're not regulating these companies, right? It's a fraud. And then we say, well, give them a certificate. Let's do the certificate. Let them sell this. It'll do something good. It'll help. We're 30 years into this policy now. We're 30 years into the policy. We have climate collapses underway. So what I do is I go to cities and say, look, there was a moment for certificates, maybe, which was in 1995. You could maybe argue, yeah, we need an incentive to stimulate the formation of a renewable energy market. You could make the argument that we need to stimulate investment in renewable energy, and this will stimulate the activity. But the idea that now, if we're saying we need a climate solution, we need an energy transition like the UN says by 2030, that just ain't happening. So that the idea that somehow the certificate is going to get us there somehow is the idea that representation will get us to democracy somehow. It will not. It will just hold us in this holding pattern of denial and fraud. And so, what I mean by fraud is just in the sense of English. Within that system, I know it's nuanced, right? Because there's different classes of certificates. Each state has its own taxonomy, but there's a high quality certificate, there's a low quality certificate. Problem is, consumers don't make this distinction. They don't know. And you can tell them 10 times and they'll look at you like, what's for dinner?
And consumers often don't end up involved in trading the certificates. That's
Yeah.
too complex for somebody who just wants the panels installed on their roof to get into. So usually someone else is taking care of that, and who knows what their motivations are, or how they go about it.
Yeah. Yeah. But even I would say the high quality certificates, like here in Massachusetts, you have the class one certificate is the high quality certificate. The class three is the low. So the class three is Texas wind credits that are sold across state lines. Everyone pretty much agrees by now that that's fraud. The benefits are intangible. So people are paying extra. It's not really causing a benefit. But then they'll still defend the class one. They'll say, well, it's a real Massachusetts renewable energy project. What's wrong with that? Well, here's the problem. It's better, but it's better like a demon is better than the devil. It's a demon. And the reason it's a demon is there is a real thing that people can do. There's a real thing, but they have to think of what the real thing is, right? And so if you dilute their minds, any consumer that wants to, I'm going to do something about climate. I want to reduce my footprint or whatever. I want to go green. I want to change the way I live. Well, what are your choices? And they're going to get this menu. And on this menu, doing the real thing is way the hell over on the left. Doing the bullshit thing is way the hell over on the right. And in the middle is a class one certificate. It looks like kind of the reasonable thing to do. That's good, right? But what they don't realize is that a class one certificate facility can be 10 years old. So, climate benefit? Not really. I mean, sort of. The facility would be there whether or not you bought it. You didn't really cause anything to happen. You're just helping something that already happened, right? Then there's the jobs benefit. No, not really. I mean, not really. So all the benefits and there's a bunch. There's multiplier effect, local economy. Um, they're just not there. And so there's resilience, not there. It's anywhere in the state. It's not going to help you. You're not going to have a blackout and you're going out, man. You're finished. And so, like all these things that you associate with this decision of regular person, educated or not, but just the vague idea of wanting to do something real, and they give it their attention for that window of time where they're thinking. For me, that attention is sacred. That's the one moment in their lives where a person is saying, I want to do something. And you lie to them. For me, that's just like, God, it's a crime. It's a crime. It's a moral crime, if not a legal crime. It's a crime because they'll never do that again. They'll get lied to. And after that, they're just like, they're senile. They're like, what happened? The cord is cut. Now I don't know what's real anymore because I gave the guy my money and it turns out that it's not here. It's in Rhode Island. It was built in 2012. And like, why? And so for me, there's that. Um, it's also just, it's not real. It's encouraging someone to think that by checking a box or writing a check, it's just not real. That people can be more involved in that. And that if they're not more involved, we're not really solving the problem. So I just think the engagement side, the need to get people involved, to that's why I focus on this sort of sensory. Like, can you find your feet? Can you believe this is here? Can you like retreat from madness? Really, because I really think in the economic sphere and the political sphere, we are mad. We've already kind of gone. We've lost the ability to navigate these worlds, and we're returning into a private world. It's quite dangerous, I think, and at the same time that it presents this opportunity for subjective like reason, which we didn't have when we believed in those systems. But I do think that all those systems are really not credible. And so to probably over answer your question.
No, that was great. Thank you. And where you ended up, I think, is a nice place for us to go. You said that our economic system and our political system is already over the brink of madness. You didn't say quite those words, but along those lines. And so that makes me curious about where you see where you see this going, what you would what advice you would give to folks that might be listening, and to Brian and myself, from your standpoint. And I think we're kind of getting back to philosophy, right? Like, how do you see this unfolding, and what should we do?
Wow, that's that's the hardest question of all. What should we do? I tend to think what we should do is realize that our madness is not as bad as it seems, because we're really just realizing that something we thought was real is not real. So we were more insane during the Cold War than we are now, but we didn't know it. They were, the CIA was much worse in the 70s than they are today, in Central America.
We
The Brit-
hope. Yeah,
What's that?
we hope.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, that's you never know. But I mean, it's really consciousness that's causing us to become insane, which I think goes back to Brian's point that that in a way there is this force that's pushing the envelope of, if you want to call it history, back to the person where we can think again. We are able to think because it was such repression. I mean, remember obviously the blacklisting of communists and all that, and it was scary. It was really scary. You had Hitler, you had the bomb, you had Stalin, you had Chinese Cultural Revolution. You had really crazy stuff going on through all the way through, and not just under governments, but under civil society. Think of of the '70s and all the cults. It was just people were just totally nuts. It's just like, and then now there's this kind of stillness and inability to speak. It seems to me is what's sort of happening now, where we're all just kind of like don't really know what to say. But on the other hand, we know that we don't know. Go back to Socrates. We know that we don't know, and it causes this profound sense of distress, almost like a hangover. It's just like, oh, and a real nausea, ambivalence, disgust, but also self-disgust and fear and anxiety. And it's almost like we're waking up. We're sort of thawing, and it's sickening. It's a sickening feeling,
Do you think we're seeing a self-organizing system moving into a state of criticality? so that it can reorganize itself? And I mean, that's my thinking, is that do we design our way out of us, or do we evolve and live our way out of it by by like the clown on the unicycle who almost falls before he catches his balance and reestablishes himself? It seems like we need to get to these crazy places for things to shift and to come out at their 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. Like, is this part of that big historical Hegelian dialectic, do you think?
I gotcha. I gotcha. It's a fascinating question. I don't know. If it's Hegelian, because Hegelian was so centered on the state and viewed the state as this instrument of cultural improvement, basically, put it plainly. And I don't think it's that. I think that that's the fraud of the state. And the state took over religion. And when princes took over during after the Protestant Revolution, took over the power to choose the bishops, and like Henry VIII, and once this, and then and the birth of ideology that followed, and then the tremendous importance attached to political and economic ideology since then, which directly resembles the church. And so, from my point of view, it's really that the church has persisted in the state, and it simply is destructive. It simply needs to be basically dropped. There is no solution to this. It is simply the ghost of religion. It must die. And so, in that view, I take the anarchist position of Proudhon, the French anarchist, which is the state needs to go away. And when I say go away, I don't mean destroy the state. I don't mean rebellion against the state. I mean just we need to stop paying attention to it, actually.
We need to grow out of it, would you say?
Yeah, we need to shift our minds from the state, from watching the TV or the whatever YouTube, or watching, the president, voting all the presidential elections, and constantly talking about the president. I'm guilty as well. My family and I, we talk, and then we yell at each other about, let's stop talking about this idiot. What is the point of this? It has no point. We're expressing our impotence by discussing it. It is humiliation to talk about this, and it is of no constructive purpose whatsoever. We need to wean ourselves. So I say it's sort of like the Renaissance Pope. It's like, do you realize that the Pope is corrupt? Well, yes, I do, but the church is different from the Pope. It's like, no, no, no. The church is not different from the Pope. The government is not different from the president. This is a problem. And so if we can't detach our gaze, our eyes, then we will continue to go mad, because it is the reason that we are mad. And it has no solution. It is a trap. We are trapped, and we're going mad. And so the issue is just, can we turn away from it, which isn't to destroy it or resist it or revolt against it. Just, can we turn away from it, and can we focus on our feet where we live? Can we change our desire? Can we shift our aspiration, the horizon of our aspiration, from that spectacle of the nation to the place that we live? Can we shift it and understand that psychologically, that if we don't, that we are mad, that all of the prestige and importance that we attribute to that city, Washington, is our madness. It is the nightmare of that we live in. It's not just what it is; what we've made it in our minds, and we have to let go of it. That it's is not. It does exist. It is dangerous, but it has no promise whatsoever. It cannot be improved. And so it isn't to deny its existence, right, or pretend it isn't there, but it's just like, we need to do something else. And it isn't just to like localize and grow our own food like Voltaire or whatever, Candide. It's actually, no, we need to rethink what government is. And we can change the one we have, but we have to go there and change it. And that's in the town hall. And so it's a creative exercise. In my view, it's tremendously exciting, because it's actually possible to do any number of things at the town hall, like with CCA. I did that. I had no support from any NGOs. I had no money, no political party affiliation, nothing. It was just because the towns took it up. And if people took it up in the towns, then the legislative delegations kind of accommodate and they support it. And slowly it just trickles up, you know, into the higher levels. And they back off. They let it be because it is. It has this sort of mass, this sort of it has mass and and they can't really fight it. It's because it's too real. They're not real. They're they just blow away. They just puffs of smoke. So even though if we watch, then the smoke takes on the genie's power. The smoke forms into this giant monster and blah, blah, blah. But if we weren't doing that, it wouldn't have that power.
Well, and it seems like where we draw the line between us and them becomes a relevant question because the government seems to be them.
Yeah.
And only when we see it as being us are can we psychologically find a place to participate in that.
No, that's true. That's true. To realize that you're in a sense that to take responsibility for what it is and not just think, "Oh, it is going bad." It's like, well, no, we're like, what are we doing? We're just sitting around watching this show and it's getting out of hand. And same with our representatives, I would say in the town hall, which is that they tend to be really pompous and there's the chaos to the I would do a lot of local government stuff and there's chaos in those meetings. It's very depressing. And when you go in there, it's like, oh God, this is the world we're going to live in, where the lunatics do all the talking and the fools and the idiots who keep asking dumb questions, and everyone just wants to leave, and it's just depressing. I really think that's the other end of the dilemma when because again, like we have no real reason to be here, and if all we're doing is going to meetings locally and not watching TV, that ain't gonna work. So we have to actually create a reason to do this.
Mhm.
Uh, and those reasons should be selfish. They need to be.
Tacos?
Yeah, maybe, but I mean, like, I'm gonna get mine. I'm gonna go down to City Hall and get mine. And I
Uh-huh.
want solar
Right.
panels. I want, XYZ. And they're gonna help me get it. And that's why I'm doing it. So I just think if we could turn that around and state it very simply, but that it's like let's like if you just in a palpable way meaningfully pursue something at the local
Mhm.
level and open up the discussion to like realize that you can open it up, you can change it. That the government doesn't have to be a police department, a fire department, a school, and a road crew.
Mhm.
Doesn't have to be that. And so, what should it be? What should we do?
Right.
Go back to your question.
Right.
What should
Right.
we do? And what should we stop doing? Like, I mean, we're really serious. We would love them to just stop fixing our road.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I like people to go slower. So nothing better than a pothole. And
Mhm.
they keep fixing it, and then I get my taxes go up. So it's also a place where left, right stops applying. It's like the Republicans are like, "Yeah, right." And, so what happened to the left, right thing? It just blows up. It's nothing.
Yeah.
Just wisps of smoke. I mean, there are places where those differences will and but so much of the left, right thing is just basically importing national spectacular politics into the local level and then getting into
Right.
dogfights about it. But when it comes to
Right.
stuff like what should we do, like right here, just here, it's a different mentality. And I do think it's a kind of sanity, a kind of like, oh, right, I actually exist and
Mhm.
I need some things. And so do you. And, because we have nothing to do with each other. That's the other part of it. Because we're watching the spectacle, w- we just have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, around our neighborhood, there was for quite a while a popular bumper sticker, and it said, because we have a lot of dirt roads, and it said, "Bad roads make good neighborhoods, the Grumpy Old Timers Association."
That is the truth. That is so true.
I really it's kind of like a calm in the storm mindset or picture you painted where just turn away from the spectacle. You don't have to be in conflict with it and you don't have to pretend it doesn't exist, but put your attention on what you can influence locally and take responsibility. And much easier said than done, especially when you talk about creating some incentive, or sense of this is going to benefit me personally to go down to City Hall and attend a meeting, because I wouldn't know how to begin manufacturing that. But I do like the sensation of taking responsibility in a local way. Um, and I bet our listeners will too. I think a lot of people, they might not have characterized what we're experiencing quite as madness, but I think it's useful to do that. And probably everybody relates to the impotence that goes with madness.
Hmm.
And I had a question related to that, Paul. Is do you think that people's it maybe sounds simplistic, but I keep feeling that people need to spend more actual time in actual natural settings and natural environments, and that somehow that might take out some of that crazy and antidote it with some realness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. Absolutely, physical existence, being related to your, particularly related to your needs. But I think it also can be achieved through anything physical. You know, I mean that the because it's in some ways. I can just give an example with the CCA 3.0. This is the way we're going to do it anyway. What we're saying is that the city of Ithaca and the town of Ithaca will allow anyone to own shares in on-site energy systems, and will facilitate the development of solar and with electric vehicles, with heating system retrofits as interoperable systems on buildings. So we're saying anyone who wants to do that, sign up, and we'll arrange for it to be done. You will ultimately make all the decisions. You'll decide whether to do it. You'll enter into the contracts with the parties. You will control it. It will be yours. But we're going to basically help you do that. And so the idea is that the government is going to help you do something. It's not, it doesn't have any ownership over what you're doing. It's just helping you do something you cannot currently do in the market unless you knew a lot about it and had money. So it's helping you with the money side, with the bank, with the suppliers, with the warranties, with the design factors, which would be incredibly expensive to make. So we're basically arranging for to dramatically reduce the engineering cost, so you can actually choose, own, and operate so-called advanced renewable systems in your home. Something that's just totally impossible right now, otherwise, right? Unless you're like a university campus or a very wealthy person that could afford a very expensive system. And so we're saying that the city should do that, and anyone's eligible, whether you're poor or rich, whether you own a building or a renter, if you're in public housing. So we're arranging this very complex, very robust program to support that. That says, okay, if you're poor, we've figured out how a poor person with no credit rating can own part of a system with someone who has a good credit rating, and facilitating that process so that no one's excluded. So here's something palpable. It's physical, right? It's saying you can get something you can't get right now. And I would say that's like going for a hike, or growing your own food. You're getting in touch with something that's real that you can't do right now. You hear about it, you read about it, you can't do it. So it's just that kind of tactile ability to effectuate something, which is sanity inducing. So I think that's an example of something a city could do. My son's actually working on a project right now to create a town farm in the next town over, and he's trying to get the town to put up the land, and he's getting people involved in the growing of the food, and he's going to sell the food at prices below Walmart. And so, like, the idea here is like real benefits, not sacrifice your, pay him extra to be green or mitigate your this or all this, what I would call ascetic measures, but no, selfish activities, but which are common selfishness, shared selfishness. That's the definition of cooperation, of mutualism. It is not ascetic. It is not donating. You are not cooperating with someone else just to help them. You're helping each other. You mutually benefit from the cooperation. And so it is selfish. Cooperation is selfish. And I really feel like that's that activity. Uh, and if it can draw you into growing food or farming, if anything real, we're also working on waste because right now what happens with our waste, we dump it. It goes kitchen waste. 95% of household waste is non-recyclable. It goes into landfills. It gets incinerated. Mostly, it's sent to low-income communities, Indian reservations. From here, that's all sent down south to poor people. It's just disgraceful, right? And so this is abstraction. And everyone around here has a Black Lives Matter sign, so I'm very fond of going to them and saying, like, really, you're dumping your garbage, in black neighborhoods. I mean, that you've been doing that for half a century, and like, really. And so it's like that causes this incoherence, which is it's like you're crazy. You're so shameless. You'd have a Black Lives Matter sign on your lawn when you're poisoning them, and you think nothing of it, nothing. And if I tell them, confront them about it, they look at me just like blank faces, just like, what the hell's the matter with you? Like, what are you doing? And so just that's also physical. It's like, do manage this, like deal with this. It's your waste. Deal with it. And if you just do, then it's like this palpable thing. Like, okay, like we're handling it, we're figuring it out, and we're taking care of it. Do the best we can. And everyone's like, oh God, we're gonna get poisoned. We're gonna poison ourselves now. We're gonna get poisoned. Okay, but I mean, what do you want?
You know, it reminds me of Tolstoy's book called "What Then Should We Do."
Uh-huh.
It's a book that nobody knows. They know War and Peace, and they know Anna Karenina. It's
Oh,
great,
I'll
you
have to
know?
look it up.
Yeah, it's really great. It shows what intellectual integrity the man has. But one of the things he says in there is he says it's all well and good to not wanna see, to wanna see your neighbor, do better and to wanna, see the people at the bottom rise up. But if you're really sincere about that, the first thing you really should do is take your boot off their neck. And we kind of do that. We don't do it. Culture does it for us, doesn't it? Because most of those people, they don't know where their shit goes. See, I have an outhouse. I know where my shit goes. And I know my compost goes to the chickens, right? Because I also understand, having run big water systems and things, that moving the problem isn't always solving the problem.
Yeah,
And sometimes that's all we're really doing,
yeah, because
is moving the problem.
it mystifies. When you put your shit, because we have cows and chickens and whatever. We do that kind of stuff too, where you're moving things around. I mean, you move your compost pile, and you see that the chickens eat it, and they dig it under, and then you shovel it, and then they unshovel it, and you shovel it, they unshovel it, and you realize you're working together. They're helping you compost the pile, they're helping you break it down, and it's so beautiful because something that was a liability becomes a benefit. Something that was waste, this dirty thing, get it out of here. It's crazy. If you think about it, it's psychotic, it's paranoid, it's dirty.
Yeah.
It's like you just ate it, man, and you're already disgusted. Like the moment it hits the sink, you're like, oh, oh, it's in your mouth. You know what I mean? It really is crazy. But if you start to manage those physical things that are part of your life, including your outhouse, right? It is. I miss having an outhouse because we had an outhouse the last place. It's great. You dig a really deep hole, you fill it up, cover it over, dig another deep hole, fill it up. It
Yeah.
doesn't do any
Yeah.
harm. In fact, you're building this beautiful long-term biomass there that someday someone's going to grow a huge tree in it probably. And so it's just things that seemed kind of evil and nefarious and scary become utterly harmless and actually positive. And it really is sanity inducing to do all that big time.
And the chickens, they don't just do it for you. You literally made their
Yeah,
day.
they're loving it. Yeah. I
Yeah, it's like this is what they're all about.
with the eggs, and like people can't believe the eggs you get from this, because you can't buy an egg, even the fanciest, farmer's market egg, really. I mean, some of them, but most of them are using feed. And so if you let your chickens out, it's pretty rare, and you see a chicken like that, and it's like paradise. You're actually creating paradise when you do that. Something that the super wealthy pay obscene amounts to simulate, but otherwise no one has unless they're doing it themselves. And I really do think it's having that connection, that reconnection, that you can do things, that you're not just this kind of doddering, weak animal that just has a credit card and wait for the service personnel, and when he's going to
Uh-huh,
leave,
yeah.
he's fixing my washing machine, when is he going to leave so I can be alone again, and just this sickly mind that they really have like manufactured. It's we've been made this way. This is not how we are. We don't have to be this way, and we're not.
Well, when I went in the DIY direction probably 35 years ago.
Oh no.
And for most of that time, it was settled opinion that I was just crazy. I was just eccentric, yeah, that's and I know they talk behind their hand, and I actually had a relative say, "Yeah, yeah, they all think you're the crazy one." Well, an odd thing happened maybe about 10 years ago. I stopped looking quite so crazy. Now, I haven't changed at all. If anything, I'm doubled down, right? So, I wonder, is the listening changed? Are people have we finally gotten to the point where that modern impulse that says that of course the big corporation is going to do a better product than I'm going to do myself, and of course it's going to be safe, and of course they'll take care of my health, and of course they'll, that putting it outside of ourselves. You think things are changing? Is the listening changing? You think you've dealt with the public, or you think it's just will to receive and you just apply to their basic.
Well, yeah, I mean the certainly climate change made people aware that the way they're living is extremely destructive and untenable, but also the toxicity of everything, I think, is probably, I mean, it's pretty out there. I mean, how toxic every,
Our health numbers are crazy.
yeah, the pervasive and all, yeah, the health numbers are really insane. The particularly younger people are, it's, it's really terrifying, and just the the failure of regulatory agencies, the FDA, the EPA, but state agencies too. Like I was mentioning, the waste practice today, that they're still spreading biosolids, which is, human waste treatment plant waste, human shit waste, even though they know it's full of forever chemicals. And we're going around, we're doing work on this now, local power, because we work with municipalities, saying, look, do you realize that you have lined landfill in your town? Lined collects, when it rains, it collects the water into a tank. You every month, every one of those guys has to have a permit to dump those
Right.
leachates, that fluid,
Discharge permit,
full of
yeah.
PFAS. It's full of PFAS. They bring it to the waste treatment plant in every town in America, and they run it. They mix it with the sewage.
The
Mixed with
sludge, yeah.
and these are under federal state permits. They have to do this. And then they take the sludge and they make biosolids, and they are actively still today spreading biosolids on farms all over the country.
Yep,
There's only the
yep.
city level, certain cities and counties that are blocking it. States are not blocking it. They know that it's full of forever. I mean, this is absurd. So the idea that they're regulating or protecting, it's just like they're not. This is not working like at all. And so I think there's awareness that the regulatory systems don't work. That and it isn't like just a kind of Republican rejection of regulation. It's just like this doesn't. I mean, it's largely because of Republican rejection of regulation that it doesn't work. But it's been so long now that the idea that that kind of centralized system would work is losing credibility. The same way that centralized government would work is losing credibility, and the awareness that we need to kind of have more control, and then obviously the supply chain stuff, COVID awareness that like we can't even get vinegar, I mean, there's just literally nothing, that everything, just because of all the outsourcing and all the dependence on foreign trade that's happened the last, since the early 90s or whatever, free trade. There's different kinds of facets of awareness of how the system we have is harmful, unpredictable, and maybe more respect for those that are doing things themselves. Yeah, I think I could see that. We've had relatives of ours who were very conventional in the way that they live. Say, you guys are doing the right thing. Like they would like to do it, but they're too old. They don't want to make the change right now or whatever. but they can kind of see the logic of it. I still think they probably think we're crazy, but ultimately, because it all comes down to habits, and habits are hard. They're that hard to change, but they feel hard to change before you change them. Uh,
Good. Well, I'm really excited for our next conversation already, Paul.
hey, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you both. I really, really enjoyed it. I've never, don't think I've ever had quite such a good interview. Thank you.
That's awesome. We love to hear that, and we'll listen back, and we'll get all kinds of ideas for what to talk about next too. So,
Okay.
but thank you again, and look forward to next time.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.